I swear I didn't notice the changes all at once. They crept in slowly, like cold air slipping through a cracked window at night, annoying enough to feel, but too faint to track. At first, I thought he was just tired, maybe overwhelmed with work. He kept canceling dinners with our friends, saying he wasn't in the mood or needed to stay focused. I tried brushing it off, telling myself couples go through phases. But deep down, that tiny knot in my stomach started tightening, and I couldn't explain why. What troubled me most was how out of character it all was. He used to love being around people. He'd tease me about being too shy, then drag me to backyard barbecues and birthday gatherings anyway. Back then, he said our friends were the family we chose. Remember? So when he started avoiding them, I felt this weird mix of confusion and guilt, like maybe I'd done something wrong. Every canceled plan felt like a door closing between us. Still, I kept giving him the benefit of the doubt, because that's what you do when you love someone. And then came the invitations he'd pretend never existed. I'd hear my phone ping, look down, and see a friend asking if we wanted to join them for drinks. I'd mention it to him casually, and he'd shrug, saying he wasn't up for being around anyone lately. The way he said anyone stung, as if I wasn't enough to pull him out of whatever hole he'd dug himself into. Every time he brushed off another invitation, I felt a little part of me dim. I didn't know it yet, but those skipped nights out were already hiding a truth that would soon choke the air out of me. I remember one Friday night in particular, the kind that should have felt cozy and effortless. I'd opened a bottle of wine, the good one we kept for special moments, and I'd lit a candle that smelled like vanilla and orange peel. But he walked in, saw the setup, and barely even blinked before saying he was exhausted and wanted to shower. The disappointment hit me so fast it almost felt childish. I tried laughing it off, saying I'd save the wine for another night, but the room already felt empty. I went to bed early, pretending I wasn't waiting for him. Over time, it wasn't just the canceled plans, it was the way our friends acted around me. Their hugs felt shorter, their smiles a little too careful, like they were stepping around invisible cracks on the ground. One of them even said she'd been meaning to call me, but her voice trembled in a way I didn't catch back then. Looking back, it's obvious they were terrified of slipping up. I kept wondering why everyone suddenly seemed so distant. I blamed myself again, thinking maybe I'd withdrawn without realizing. If only I knew what they were really protecting. Then came the night he stared at his phone like it held a live grenade. I was folding laundry on the couch when the screen lit up, and his whole body froze. He said it was just work, but his voice cracked in the middle, like a bad note in a song. I didn't push. I didn't want to be that wife, the paranoid one. But the silence that followed felt heavy, almost greasy, like I couldn't wash it off no matter how hard I tried. And still, I had no idea how deep the lies already ran beneath our feet. The weekends became the hardest part. You know that feeling when the house is too quiet, but your mind is too loud? That was me, walking from room to room, trying to shake off the sense that something was slipping through my fingers. He claimed he needed downtime, yet he spent most of it glued to his phone or pretending to nap. I'd catch him flinching at notifications, turning the screen away as if I'd try to steal a glance. I didn't understand why he suddenly felt like a stranger sharing my air. I even tried suggesting a little getaway for just the two of us, a simple weekend by the coast, nothing fancy. He said he had too much on his plate, that it wasn't the right time. The rejection sat in my chest like a stone. I'd always been the one who believed trips could fix things, or at least remind people why they chose each other. But his face barely changed when he said no, like he'd rehearsed it ahead of time. For the first time, I wondered if he was avoiding me, not our friends. Still, I kept pushing my doubts down, burying them under chores, errands, and long showers where I let the water drown out my thoughts. I kept telling myself relationships have slow seasons, that I was being dramatic. But every night, when he rolled to the far edge of the bed, the truth pressed harder against my ribs. Something was wrong. Deeply wrong. I just couldn't see the shape of it yet. And I had no idea that the answers I was desperate for were already swirling around me, whispered in rooms I wasn't meant to enter. It was around this time that I started noticing the pattern, a pattern so obvious now that I can't believe I missed it. He didn't just avoid all our friends. He avoided specific ones. The closest ones. The ones who used to call him brother, who showed up for birthdays, who drank beer on our porch and laughed too loud. When I suggested inviting one of those couples over, he stiffened like I'd touched a bruise. He said they'd been weird lately, but the truth was, he was the one acting weird, and I kept trying to piece together a puzzle without knowing half the pieces were hidden. Every time I mentioned a name from that inner circle, he'd find a way to shut the conversation down. They're busy. They're traveling. They're going through stuff. He always had an excuse ready, as if he'd practiced for every scenario. I felt this cold little flicker of dread each time, but I kept swallowing it down. I didn't want to accuse him of anything. I just wanted my marriage to feel like mine again. The harder I tried to pull us back toward normal, the faster he seemed to run the other way. And I still didn't know what he was running from. The weirdest moment was when I suggested having dinner with Mark and Elise, his absolute closest friends. He practically snapped, saying I didn't need to force anything, and that they had their own issues. But his tone, God, his tone told me everything and nothing at once. It wasn't irritation, it was fear. Fear of being around them while I was in the room. Fear that something might slip out. I didn't know what secret he was guarding so tightly, but I could feel it hovering right behind me, like someone standing close enough to breathe on my neck. The emotional distance started sinking into my daily routine. I'd be chopping vegetables or folding towels and suddenly feel that heaviness wash over me, the kind that makes your chest tighten for no reason. Nights that used to be filled with laughter or random conversations about nothing turned into quiet, disconnected evenings. He'd sit on one end of the couch, scrolling endlessly, while I tried to pretend I wasn't watching him more than the TV. Every time his phone lit up, he'd tilt it away, almost instinctively, and with every secret flicker of that screen, my confidence dimmed just a little more. I even tried to bring up the shift between us gently, choosing my words like I was stepping around broken glass. I told him I felt like we were drifting, like something was off. He sighed, looked at me like I was overreacting, and said I was getting in my own head again. Hearing him say that made my stomach twist. He'd said it before in other arguments, that phrase he used when he wanted to shut down any questions. I started doubting myself, wondering if maybe I was seeing things that weren't really there. It was the perfect setup for gaslighting, and I didn't even realize it. Even my body started picking up on what my mind refused to acknowledge. I couldn't sleep well, and when I did, my dreams were restless and full of shadows. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night and hear him in the living room, whispering into his phone. When I asked who he'd been talking to, he said he'd been checking an email. At 2 a.m. But I let it slide because part of me still hoped things would settle down. I had no idea the truth was already spilling around the edges, just waiting for the right moment to burst through. One evening, I decided to test the waters. I casually mentioned that I might invite Mark and Elise over myself, just to catch up. The way he froze. It was like someone had hit pause on him. He insisted they wouldn't be available, that now wasn't a good time, and that I should let it go. Let it go. Those words felt like a slap. Since when did reconnecting with friends require permission? Since when did seeing people we loved make him panic like that? His reaction told me more than any confession could have. After that night, I began paying attention to the tiny details, the ones that slip past you the first time because you're too trusting. The late-night showers. The phone he took with him everywhere, even to the backyard. The sudden, unexplained need for privacy. Even the way he dressed changed subtly, like he wanted to impress someone but couldn't admit it. I kept trying to rationalize it, telling myself everyone goes through phases. But the universe kept nudging me, whispering that these weren't random coincidences. They were warnings. And that whisper grew louder when a friend I trusted, someone outside his tight circle, gave me a strange look one afternoon. She didn't say much, just that she hoped I was taking care of myself and that I deserved honesty. It felt like she was handing me a puzzle piece without being able to say where it fit. I remember driving home that day with my heart pounding in my throat, sensing that something was unraveling. I just didn't know then how deep the unraveling went, or how many people had been sitting on the truth behind my back. The truth didn't show up gently. It crashed into me on a day that was supposed to be simple. I wasn't even meant to be at that gathering. I only stopped by because I'd forgotten my jacket there earlier. When I stepped inside, I heard laughter, the casual kind friends share when they think life is ordinary. But then I heard my name. Not loudly, not accusingly, just softly, wrapped inside a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. And right after my name, I heard hers. A woman's name I didn't recognize. I froze behind the half-open door, my hand still gripping my keys. Their voices lowered, but not enough to hide the truth. One of them said he was digging his own grave, and that she'll find out sooner or later. Another sighed and said he couldn't understand how my husband thought he could keep this up. I felt my chest tighten like someone was cinching a belt around my ribs. The room suddenly felt too bright, too loud, too cruelly honest. I didn't know whether to scream or run. When I heard the third voice mention that everyone knew except her, my knees nearly gave out. Everyone but me. The humiliation hit me first, hot, sharp, suffocating. Then came the heartbreak, rolling through me like a wave I couldn't outrun. I stayed perfectly still, trying not to make a sound, because I needed every detail, every word. I needed to know how long they'd all watched me play the fool. And with every whispered sentence, a part of me broke, and something colder began forming in its place. I slipped back outside before anyone could notice me, but the damage was done. The air felt thick, like it didn't want to enter my lungs, and I remember leaning against my car just to stay upright. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped my keys twice. The world around me kept moving, cars passing, dogs barking, someone laughing in the distance. But I felt like I'd stepped out of my own life. It's strange how betrayal doesn't just hurt. It disorients you, like someone rearranged the furniture in your mind. I kept replaying their words, trying to stitch them together into something survivable. As I drove home, the memories started flooding back, connecting themselves like poisoned dots on a map. Every canceled dinner, every awkward glance from our friends, every time he told me not to overthink. The lies didn't arrive suddenly. They had been stacking quietly, like bricks in a wall I never saw being built. And behind that wall, he had been living a whole other life, one everyone else knew about. The humiliation felt like a fever beneath my skin, burning and freezing me at the same time. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles went white. Part of me wanted to cry until there was nothing left, but another part, the part that had been ignored, dismissed, pushed aside, started speaking for the first time. It said, "Pay attention." It said, "Stop protecting him." It said, "You deserve the truth. All of it." By the time I pulled into the driveway, the heartbreak was still raw, but something sharper had taken root too. Something that felt a lot like resolve, even if I didn't yet know what to do with it. Walking into the house felt different that night, like stepping into a place I no longer recognized. The air smelled the same, the lights were the same, but everything felt tainted. I could hear the shower running upstairs, the steady rhythm of water hitting tile. That sound used to comfort me. Now it felt like a warning. I stood in the hallway for a moment, staring up the stairs, wondering how many lies had been washed down that drain. My heart was beating so loudly I could almost hear it over the water. I walked into our bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed, letting my fingers trace the fabric of the comforter, the same one we'd chosen together during a weekend trip. It suddenly felt heavy under my touch, like it was carrying the weight of everything I didn't know. My mind replayed the voices I'd overheard, their pity so thick it clung to me like smoke. I kept asking myself, how long had I been living next to a stranger? How long had he let me love him while hiding an entire betrayal behind my back? When he finally came out of the shower, steam trailing behind him, he barely looked at me. He mumbled something about being tired and grabbed his phone off the counter like it was oxygen. I watched him scroll, watched his thumb move fast, nervous, practiced, and I realized this was it. The moment the illusion finally shattered. I didn't have the full truth yet, but I knew one thing with absolute clarity. Whatever I learned next would change everything. And I could feel myself standing at the edge of that discovery, one breath away from stepping into it. I didn't confront him that night. I was too raw, too shaken, too afraid of what might spill out if I opened my mouth. Instead, I lay awake beside him, listening to his breathing, steady, calm, like a man with nothing to fear. Meanwhile, mine was shallow and shaky, catching on every exhale. I kept staring at the ceiling, wondering how many times he'd slept soundly next to me after spending the day with her. The thought made my stomach twist. But I knew I needed clarity before I said a single word. The next morning, I watched him carefully. The way he grabbed his coffee, the way he avoided my eyes, the way he kept his phone face down, as if the screen itself might betray him. I finally told him we needed to talk. Calmly, without yelling, without giving him anywhere to hide. I told him I'd overheard something the night before, something about him and another woman. His face changed instantly, drained of color so fast it almost scared me. And in that split second, I felt the truth land between us like a blow. He didn't even deny it at first. He just stared at me, blinking too slowly, like his mind was scrambling for the right version of the lie. Then he said he didn't know what I heard, and that I'd probably misunderstood. When I repeated the woman's name, the one I'd heard whispered, he froze. Completely. That's when the denial started crumbling around the edges. His shoulders slumped, his eyes darted away, and I saw panic settle under his skin. I wasn't angry yet. I was too numb for anger. All I wanted was the truth he'd never intended to give me. Once his denial started to crumble, the excuses spilled out like water from a cracked glass. He said it wasn't serious, that it didn't mean anything, that he'd been confused. Hearing those words made something inside me snap quietly. Not like a scream, but like a thread breaking under too much weight. He kept insisting he still loved me, as if love and betrayal could coexist peacefully in the same sentence. I stood there, listening to him try to negotiate his way out of the truth. And for the first time, I saw him clearly. Not as my husband, but as a coward. Then came the part that truly disgusted me. He admitted his friends knew. He said they didn't want to get involved, that they thought it was better not to tell me. He begged me not to ruin things with them, as if I were the one who created this mess. I felt the anger rising then, hot, sharp, electric, spreading through my body like wildfire. He said he didn't want to destroy his image, that people would judge him, and all I could think was, you cared more about their approval than my heartbreak. But I didn't yell. I didn't throw anything. I didn't even cry. I just let him talk, watching him twist himself into knots, watching him panic, watching him try to rewrite the story while I stood there holding the real one. Something about my silence made him even more desperate. He started pacing, running his hands through his hair, pleading with me to keep this between us. I realized in that moment that revenge didn't have to be loud or chaotic. Sometimes the sharpest blade is quiet, and I had already decided exactly where to cut. That night, we barely spoke. He kept hovering around me like a shadow, trying to read my face, trying to gauge how much damage he'd done. I moved through the house quietly, gathering my thoughts like fragile pieces of glass. Every time he tried to touch my arm or whisper some apology, I felt myself pull back instinctively. The distance between us had never felt wider, not even during our worst arguments. And the more he circled me, the more certain I became of what I needed to do next. I waited until he fell asleep, curled tightly on his side of the bed as if guilt had wrapped itself around him. I sat on the edge of the mattress, staring at the dim glow of my phone. My hands were steady, steadier than they should have been. I opened a message thread I'd never used before. His mother's. She adored him, treated him like the sun itself, and that was exactly why the truth would land with the force it deserved. I typed slowly, carefully, choosing words that were honest, but impossible to ignore. I didn't send it yet, not that night, but just knowing the message existed felt like regaining a piece of myself he'd been taking for months. I slipped my phone onto the nightstand and lay back down, staring at the ceiling again. This time, though, the ache in my chest wasn't just pain, it was purpose. I knew the confrontation with his family would shatter the last illusion he had clung to. And as I drifted into a restless sleep, I felt the first spark of something fierce and freeing beginning to grow inside me. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. It wasn't peace, not yet, but a sharp, steady knowing. He moved around the kitchen anxiously, making coffee he didn't drink, glancing at me like he expected me to explode. I didn't. I just watched him, noticing every twitch, every shaky breath, every nervous glance at his phone. It was almost pathetic, seeing him try to pretend our life was normal. He had no idea the ground beneath him was already cracking. After he left for work, I sat at the kitchen table and finally opened the message draft again. My fingers hovered over the screen for a moment, not out of doubt, but out of respect for what came next. I wasn't exposing him out of spite. I was exposing him because the truth deserved a voice, and I was done being silent. I read through every line carefully, making sure it wasn't emotional, just factual. She deserved honesty, I deserved honesty, and he deserved the consequences he'd been running from. When I hit send, a strange calm washed over me. Icy at first, then warm, like stepping out of a storm into a quiet room. I didn't shake, I didn't cry, I didn't second-guess myself. I simply stood up, made myself a cup of tea, and sat in the silence that finally felt like mine again. I knew she'd call soon. His mother always called when something felt even slightly wrong. And when the phone finally rang, vibrating across the tabletop like a warning bell, I took a deep breath and answered. Her voice came through the phone trembling, not with anger but with heartbreak. She asked me to repeat everything, word for word, and I did, calmly, without adding a single dramatic twist. I told her how long he'd been avoiding our friends, how every sign pointed to someone else, and how I'd finally overheard the truth. She didn't interrupt me once. When I finished, there was a long silence, the kind that stretches across generations. Then she whispered she was so disappointed, and those words alone were enough to shake the floor beneath him. She insisted on coming over, and within an hour she was at my door, eyes red, jaw tight, holding her purse like she needed something to grip. She hugged me, a real hug, not one of pity but of understanding. She kept saying I didn't deserve any of this, that she wished she'd known sooner, that she would have confronted him herself. Hearing those words made something in my chest unclench. For the first time in months, I felt seen. Not as a clueless wife or an inconvenient obstacle, but as someone who had been deeply wronged. When he finally arrived home and saw her sitting on our couch, his face drained faster than when I confronted him. He stuttered, asked what was going on, glanced at me like I'd betrayed him. His mother didn't even let him speak. She told him she knew everything, every lie, every cowardly choice, every moment he let an entire circle of people watch me be humiliated. She said she'd never been so ashamed of him. I watched him crumble, watched the panic flood his eyes, and for once, I didn't step in to save him. He tried shifting the blame onto me, saying I overreacted, that I should have come to him instead of involving his family. Hearing him twist the truth like that would have shattered me months ago, but now it only clarified who he truly was. His mother cut him off, saying he had no right to call honesty an attack. He looked at me then, eyes wide, pleading in that desperate way men do when they finally realize the consequences have arrived. But I didn't soften. I couldn't. Not after everything. He followed me to the bedroom afterward, trying to get me alone, trying to convince me we could fix this. His voice shook. His hands shook. He couldn't even look me directly in the eyes. He said he didn't want to lose me, that he'd do anything, that the affair was a mistake that went too far. And all I could think was how he'd spent months choosing her over our life, over our trust, over the simplest respect. I didn't yell. I just told him the truth. He'd already lost me the moment he decided to hide his double life. I packed a small bag, just enough for a few days, and walked past him without flinching. His mother didn't stop me. She only touched my arm gently, as if giving me permission to choose myself. He begged me at the doorway, voice cracking, saying we could move past this if I just stayed quiet. But silence is what helped him betray me in the first place. And as I stepped outside and closed the door behind me, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. The first breath of freedom, and the beginning of a life he would no longer control. The first night away from him felt strangely quiet, almost foreign. I slept in a guest room at a friend's house, wrapped in a blanket that didn't smell like my old life. For the first time in months, I didn't fall asleep listening for footsteps or whispered phone calls. I didn't wake up with that weight on my chest. Instead, I lay there staring at the ceiling, letting the silence settle into my bones. It wasn't peace yet, but it was the beginning of it. The next morning, I made myself coffee and realized how long it had been since I tasted something without resentment clinging to the edges. I sat by the window, watching sunlight spill across the floorboards, and I felt something shift in me, something small but real. I'd been blaming myself for not seeing the signs, for trusting too much, for loving too deeply. But as I watched the world wake up, I understood that trust isn't a flaw. Betrayal is. And his choices were never my burden to carry. I spent the day walking through a nearby park, letting my thoughts breathe in the open air. Each step felt like it shook off a little of the shame he'd left on me. I remembered the woman I was before the lies, before the secrets, before I started shrinking to fit inside the version of me he needed. And with every memory, I felt my spine straighten just a bit more. I didn't know exactly what my future looked like now, but for the first time in a long time, that uncertainty didn't scare me. A few days later, his mother called me again, not to drag me back, not to smooth things over, but simply to check on me. She said she'd spoken to him and that he was a shell of himself, wandering around the house like a man who didn't know which part of his life had collapsed first. I listened quietly, not out of satisfaction, but out of clarity. Actions have consequences, and this was the one he feared most, losing the approval he'd protected at my expense. I didn't feel guilty, not even a little. I started creating new routines, tiny rituals that grounded me. Morning walks, long showers, cooking meals just for myself without rushing or worrying whether he'd like them. It was strange how the smallest choices felt like rebellion, choosing my own movie, my own schedule, my own silence. I met with an old friend for lunch, someone who apologized for not telling me sooner. Instead of anger, I felt a kind of bittersweet relief. I wasn't invisible anymore. I was stepping back into my own life, one gentle piece at a time. At night, I would sit with a journal and write down the things I'd ignored for too long, my needs, my dreams, my disappointments. Seeing it all on paper felt like pulling thorns out of my skin one by one. It hurt, but it also healed. I realized I had spent years molding myself to fit his comfort, his image, his expectations. Now I was relearning how to breathe without asking for permission, and every line I wrote in that journal made me wonder what else I might rediscover if I kept moving forward. Eventually, he tried reaching out to me. Long messages, missed calls, excuses wrapped in apologies. He said he didn't recognize himself anymore, that he felt like he'd lost everything that mattered. But the truth was simple. He hadn't lost me. He had thrown me away long before I walked out that door, and no amount of panic or regret could rebuild what he had shattered. I read every message, took a deep breath, and chose not to respond. Silence this time was mine to control. As the weeks passed, I started feeling lighter, like someone had quietly removed a weight from my shoulders. I reconnected with people I'd drifted from, not out of shame, but out of survival. And to my surprise, they welcomed me back with softness instead of judgment. One afternoon, while sipping tea with a friend, I realized I was laughing, genuinely laughing, for the first time in what felt like forever. It made me understand that healing doesn't come all at once. It arrives in small, stubborn moments that refuse to let the pain stay. Looking back now, I don't regret exposing him. I don't regret walking away. The only thing I regret is spending so long believing his silence was my fault. But the truth has a way of rebuilding us, even when it breaks us first. Today, I'm choosing myself, my voice, my peace, my future. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Sometimes the quietest revenge isn't chaos or cruelty. It's simply telling the truth, and then walking into a life where you no longer shrink to make someone else comfortable.